All right, everyone. So now we're going to be walking through the principles of design. The reason that we're going to be covering this is because this is going to give you sort of an essential introduction, a foundation in visual principles that will guide you through making an infographic that people actually enjoy looking at. So the first thing we're going to talk about is balance. Balance is a very important part of how you organize your layout on a page. So if we think about the balance of these two circles right now, they're very, very evenly balanced. They're taking up the same amount of attention. You're kind of drawn to both of them at the same time. What's nice about that is that you don't necessarily feel like you're being pulled off the edge of this white square. What I mean by that is this image, in contrast, technically the left and right sides of our white square are still balanced, but because the blue circle is so close to the edge, we feel like we're being pulled a little bit to the right side. It's also extremely uncomfortable. It might just be visual, people, but this amount of space having something touching the edge just that much makes people very uncomfortable at times. So the thing to pick up from this is A, leave space on the edges, but B, how close an item is to the edge of a composition will actually pull them more towards that direction, and it really does affect the overall balance of whatever it is you're trying to make. Here we have upper left corner and lower right corner. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is kind of balanced on left and right sides and on up and down, but there is something, we're a little bit heavier towards the bottom, it's a little bit heavier towards the right side. The interesting thing, though, is that for a lot of people, even though the blue circle is bigger, your eye is sort of naturally drawn up to the red circle anyway, and that is because in our language, we're reading from left to right and from up to down. So we're sort of naturally inclined to start up here in the first place, which is kind of interesting. It's interesting to know your audience that way and be able to design things with that in mind. Now, balance does not require things to be symmetrical at all. What it does require, though, is sort of an even composition of elements. So this is a decent example because we've got two elements, two different things that are calling our attention over, but we're still pretty balanced left to right because A, our circle is kind of coming over into the halfway point, so we're not too drawn over towards the left side because it's not entirely in the left side. It's a little bit into the center, but we've also got two different separated elements with this white space in between them that are calling us to look over at them. This one I like even more personally because we've still got our big red circle, we've got our multiple blue dots that are calling us over as well, but what's nice about this one is that if you look at the curvature of this circle right here, and then you look at how the blue lines are connected, these two things kind of mirror each other. And it gives you a nice sense of how these elements are interacting together. So let's look at some examples of how people have composed different things. This poster in particular is really interesting to me because we've got white figures up at the top. We've got the barrels in here that are one super bright color that's calling your attention. We've got the white text on this edge, and then we've got kind of tiny gray text. So if you sort of squint your eyes, pull back a little bit, let's take a look at where is your attention immediately going. For me in particular, it starts on the left side, and a big part of it is how bright this red is. There isn't anything else like this on the page. So kind of naturally, I'm looking at this big red barrel right here, but I follow these figures from the top thing, the thing that they want us to read, all the way down. Whoever designed this intended us to do that. So it's something to think about when you're designing stuff. Where do you want them to start, and what do you want them to look at first? This one is interesting to me because it starts in the center, but because everything is angled the same way, you do kind of read it the way that they want you to read it. It's also just interesting because it's got multiple different sizes of elements in here and multiple different colors, but when you really look at it, it's 2 big squares and 2 little squares. Notice too that the text is following the exact angle of these elements, and that even though these squares are going off the page, it's not uncomfortable because it's not just sitting right at the edge of the page. It's fully going off the page. In addition to the fact that both of these squares are coming off of the page in equal amounts. So you're sort of being pulled in both directions. It's a nicer resting point. This poster is interesting to me because we have these 2 really bright half circles on the side. But, and this is something particularly interesting to me, people are more naturally drawn towards very highly realistic images. So photographs, very highly realistic drawings, instead of big shapes and symbols. So even though these are giant circles and they're super bright colors, we're kind of equally drawn towards this side because of how realistic these flowers and these leaves are in comparison. If we're looking at infographics, I want you to sort of look at this and think about how is your eye moving through this page? I'm moving through this top section, through this section, and through this section, and through the bottom section. So is this well composed? Yes, we're seeing everything. We're able to have some resting points here. Not every single area is filled up with text or with an image. We've got a bunch of different types of data. We've got text. We have different sizes of text so that we get an idea for what's more important. The critique that I would make of this, however, is that we've got a ton of colors, a lot of colors. I think you could pick a more concise color scheme. But it's also not particularly interesting. You know, I'm going left to right, left to right, left to right, left to right. So I think there's some other examples that you could look at that are a little bit more interesting with how they're doing things. And then this one is just a particularly bad example, for the most part, because let's look at the balance of each of the sections. Our text is remarkably close to each of the images, but not close enough to be overlapping, so it's just not very intentional. This set of things next to this big block, these 2 blocks versus this block, you could think, okay, these are about the same size as this, so I guess it's balanced on left and right. But the annoying thing is that this is just a little bit higher than this, and this is just a little bit lower than this. A lot of times with balance, what you'll notice is that it's kind of the little things that set people off. Like, why doesn't this line up with this edge? So it's the tiniest little thing, but it'll set people off, it'll kind of bug people, and it won't make your infographic satisfying to look at. So your eyes should travel through the page. The visuals should be balanced, but they should also be interesting. You can have a variety of ways that you compose your sections. You need to be consistent with your icons, with your colors, with all of your style choices. So keep in mind that photos draw the eyes more than icons. And while that can be good sometimes, it can also throw off balance. So let's talk about color choice now. We're going to look at some color schemes and what that means. Our first one is monochromatic. So monochromatic essentially just means that you pick one color and you choose colors that are in the same family. So we've got a group of oranges here. Analogous means that you start with one color and you pick the colors on the color wheel that are next to that color. So if we start with orange, I can pick red and I can pick yellow. This is a super warm toned color scheme here, but it is kind of nice because everything relates to each other. It's right next to each other on the color wheel. Analogous. Oh, again, analogous. The same thing. We've got yellow, orange, and green. Complementary means that you're picking one family that are essentially the same. So here we have an orange and a sort of yellowy orange. And then you're picking the color that is totally the opposite on the color wheel. So if you look at a color wheel, the opposite of orange is blue. So we've got this complementary color scheme where we've got similar families of colors and then something that immediately grabs your eye, something opposite from that. A triad is very similar to complementary, but with 3. So if you remember the difference between primary and secondary colors from grade school, we've got red, yellow, and blue are primary colors. So you could pick families from these 3 color schemes right here and have them work together. You just wouldn't want to use the other 3, orange, purple, and green, because that would really throw off the balance. So hue refers to the actual color, yellow, red, blue. So if you hear me say hue, I'm referring to the actual color on the color wheel. Tone refers to how light and dark a color is. So tones of blue would be light blue, medium blue, and dark blue, whereas different hues would be green, purple, and orange, things like that. And then the last element that we're going to talk about is saturation. This is a really highly saturated object. This is a really low saturated object. You guys know, like your Instagram filters, turning up the saturation on an image means that it's really, really brightly colored. All of the colors are very, very high saturation. Whereas if something is completely low saturation, it's grayscale, it's black and white. So a general rule for picking your color scheme is between hue, saturation, and tone, pick 2 of those to contrast each other, or 1 of those that contrasts, and everything else should be relatively similar. So let's look at this one right here. We've got contrasting hue, we've got orange and blue, and this sort of warm gray color. So these hues are contrasting each other. We've got contrasting saturation. This orange and this blue are really highly saturated, where this is very much a gray tone. But our tone is similar. There's nothing particularly lighter or darker about any of these colors. On the blue scale, this is kind of a medium blue. On the orange scale, this is kind of a medium orange. And on the gray scale, this is kind of a medium gray. This is a similar saturation for all of these, but the hue is totally different. So we've got yellow, purple, and green. And the tone is totally different. This is a darker purple and a lighter yellow. And then the last one, our hues are similar, but our saturation is totally different. This is a grayscale version of pink, which might look blue, but is actually just pink, totally grayscale. And then contrasting tone, so this darker pink versus this lighter pink. So consider your text color and include your text color in your color scheme. Remember that negative space, that white space on a page, is resting space for your viewer. You really want to make sure you include that. And the last thing we're going to talk about is salience. Salience refers to the importance of something on a page, how your eye is drawn to something. So in salience, size of objects can draw your eye more quickly to something. So most of the time, your eye is going to go immediately to this bigger object. You're giving more salience to this big circle because of its size. You can do the same thing with color contrast. So your eye is more naturally drawn to this yellow object because there's a lot of contrast between it and the background. Whereas with this circle, there's not that much contrast. So your eye is more drawn to the yellow one. The yellow one has more salience because of that. And then the last one, motion. It doesn't really matter what the motion is. If you have something moving, it's going to have more salience. And then text. I want you to consider your whole page size. Text should contrast with the background in tone, but not in hue. So if you think about what that means, text can be dark blue on white, but it should not be dark blue on bright orange. So contrast in tone, but not in the actual colors themselves when it comes to text. Interesting fonts are good, but only to an extent. Your fonts always need to be legible, which seems obvious but is not always obvious. One exciting font at a time. So you can pick something huge and bold and fun, but don't pick more than one of those. Keep it one. And then overall, really just stick to 3 fonts. So you can have a big header text, a subheader text, and then a general text. You can have an interesting header text, subheader text, and general text. You see how we're keeping these consistent so that even though this one has more salience because it's bigger, they're still consistent with each other. Same thing here, has more salience because it's bold, has more salience because it's larger, but these two are still consistent with each other, which is really nice. And then the same thing with this last one. We've got consistency between the 3, and we've got salience for the things that need to be bigger. So that is it for the general principles of design.